Coaches Rudolf Hess and Hermann Göring helped him write the infamous book Mein Kampf. Upon his release, the book was widely circulated, and Hitler traveled throughout Germany, delivering prepared speeches with Rothschild-Warburg financing via the secret Thule and Veril societies. The Jews were to blame, shouted Hitler, for the humiliation of the Versailles Treaty and for Germany's financial ruin. What possible explanation could there be for Jewish businessmen supporting an anti-Semitic madman like Adolf Hitler and the extermination of millions of innocent Jews? One of the world's dirtiest secrets is that the exterminated Jews in Nazi Germany were not considered real Jews. They were considered Khazar Russians and Eastern Europeans whose ancestors converted to Judaism in 740 AD under their king, King Bulan. Their bloodline dates back to the Turkish tribes and to the powerful empire of Khazaria that once controlled all of Russia. Arthur Koestler, who wrote The 13th Tribe, claims that over 90% of today's Jews are racially non-Jewish and have no genetic relationship to the 12 tribes of Israel. Today's Jews, says Koestler, are more related to Attila the Hun than King Solomon of Israel. 2,000 years ago, when the Roman conquerors evicted the 12 tribes from Israel, the largest tribes, called Dan and Naphtali, settled in Denmark and Norway. Their Viking king, called King Canute, was crowned king of England, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Koestler calls the majority of today's Jews the 13th tribe because they are racially not Jewish. The Rothschilds' incestuous bloodline can be traced through their ancestor, Naphtali Hertz, who is named after their tribe of Naphtali. Over the centuries, the Rothschilds have intermarried with authentic Jewish royalty, ensuring their bloodline back to King Solomon of Israel. Denmark, which literally means the mark of Dan, maintained a truce with Germany's Nazi occupying forces for nearly 3 years. When Hitler's SS moved to arrest the Jews of Denmark, the Danish government helped ferry them to safety in Sweden and Britain. But why were the Jews of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden spared, while Jews from Russia and Eastern Europe were captured, interrogated, and thrown into slave camps and death camps?
And this is an interesting picture. This is 3 generations of Bushes: Senator Bush, President Bush, and President Bush.
Prescott Bush, George W.'s grandfather, enjoyed an illustrious banking career, became a respectable Republican senator, played golf with Eisenhower, until his past caught up with him.
Well, it's an interesting family. Prescott Bush was the grandfather, the patriarch of the family. And Prescott Bush in the 1940s had an interesting role. He was an investment banker for Brown Brothers Harriman. Unfortunately, at the very same time he was doing those things, he was the secret banker for Adolf Hitler and the Thyssen family. And he moved money for the Nazis. While his son was fighting them in the Pacific, fighting their allies in the Pacific, Dad was home doing that.
All of Prescott Bush's companies were taken over by the government due to their cooperation with the Third Reich and trading with the enemy. One of his companies operated mines in Poland, using the inmates of nearby concentration camps as forced labor.
You know, I don't think the public really ever has looked that closely at the Bush family today or in the past.
The death camps were not an accident. The seeds of hatred were planted long before the war began, and the extermination was carried out with some German industry in compliance, while the world looked on.
While the German subsidiaries of U.S. corporations made fortunes from the war industry and from the free slave labor of non-ethnic Jews, America also looked on. Masonic U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was the grandson of opium smuggler Warren Delano Jr., was too busy bombing the Japanese and developing weapons of mass destruction. Roosevelt chose Skull and Bonesman Henry Stimson as his Secretary of War. Roosevelt and Stimson ordered massive firebombing raids on Japan's 6 largest cities, killing and burning alive 250,000 Japanese men, women, and children. In the United States, innocent Japanese American families were thrown into internment prison camps. Japanese assets were frozen, Japan's oil lifeline was cut off, and crippling trade sanctions were imposed. This godless campaign of terror and merciless overkill demanded nothing less than total surrender and the removal of Japan's emperor. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, it was the suicidal act of a desperate and devastated nation. Like the 9/11 attack on the World Trade Center, U.S. intelligence had well-documented advance warnings of the planned attack on Pearl Harbor. Yet, like Bush and Rumsfeld, Roosevelt and Stimson did nothing to stop it. The big question is, why? Historians like Robert Stinnett and John Toland believe that because U.S. citizens wouldn't participate in another world war, a direct attack on U.S. soil would change their minds. The attack could also be used to justify the testing of Roosevelt's new atomic weapons of mass destruction on a human population. Einstein introduced Roosevelt to the atomic bomb in 1939. Harry Truman, a relatively unknown, uneducated business school dropout and the son of a mule trader, replaced Roosevelt as U.S. president in 1945. Truman owed his political career to Tom Pendergast, a gun-running, bootlegging, prostitution, and narcotics ring crook who sponsored Harry Truman's election into the U.S. Senate. On the advice of James Burns and Henry Stimson, Dirty Harry dropped the first radioactive atomic bomb on the human population of Hiroshima at 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, without even a warning.
2,000 feet over the city of Hiroshima. Heat from the center of the explosion reached 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, melting buildings and setting bridges on fire. Rivers and streams throughout the city began to boil. People evaporated where they stood, leaving shadows of their bodies scorched onto the streets. In a matter of seconds, 4 square miles of Hiroshima became an atomic wasteland. Several minutes passed. Then a black rain began to fall on the city. Sticky, pebble-sized drops of radioactive ash. 80,000 people died from the atomic explosion.
Tohoko was a student at Yamanaka Girls High School.
Heat rays set her hair on fire. Shockwaves would have reached her 3.5 seconds after the explosion, and her body would have been subject to pressure of up to 3.3 tons per square meter. This is roughly equivalent to the blast that would have hit her.
3 days later, while Japanese survivors were still reeling from the radioactive fallout, the United States dropped a second type of atomic bomb, nicknamed Fat Man, testing it on the human population of Nagasaki.
Was dropped on Nagasaki.
In retaliation for 2,400 American military deaths at Pearl Harbor that could have been prevented because of advance warnings, 2 U.S. atomic bombs evaporated 130,000 Japanese civilians and their families, and another 90,000 in the horrendous aftermath. To this day, Japanese survivors and their offspring suffer related genetic deformities, cancers, nightmares, and permanent environmental destruction.
My goodness alive. Young lady with the red hair right behind the school teacher there.
Mr. President, why did you drop the atom bomb?
Mr. President, the future wants to know, was it right to drop the atom bomb?
Years later, Harry Truman was asked if he did any soul-searching before giving his approval to use A-bombs against Japan. His reply was, "Hell no, I made it like that." And and he snapped his fingers in the air.
In May 1952, Harry Truman was awarded an honorary plaque, and a village in Israel was named in his honor.
I'm very touched and grateful, and a little bit overwhelmed to have a village named for me. But when they're talking about a statue, want me to join George Washington, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, and Cham Weissman, I have about come to the conclusion that I'm not ready yet to go into a piece of marble.
World War II took the lives of 35 million trusting, patriotic, flag-waving people willing to die for their country or die for freedom or die a hero. But what they really died for was the